I've talked a lot lately about indie culture, especially indie music, but I'm not sure if I've defined the word indie, and I'm not sure if everybody agrees on the same definition of the word indie. But in its most simplest form and its purest form, the word indie just means independent, and it usually applies to some sort of operation that is operating independently from either the mainstream or whatever the top controllers of that industry are doing. So indie films, indie music, indie restaurants, all that indie culture to me just means independent. Now the question I have in my research is, when did the term indie first start being used? How did it just become this popular term that means independent? And I've heard lots of different things from lots of different people, so I decided to research it. You know, interestingly, I did not find the term indie in my 1979 Webster's dictionary that I bought in high school. They didn't even list the word indie. I had actually thought the term went way back, but the earliest I found it being used is 1977, and that was with, let's see, there's a book that came out in the UK called the 77 Indie Scene, and I believe that book is out of print. And it talks about the Buzzcocks and other punk bands of that era. And then in 1980, in the UK, there was the debut of the UK Indie Chart. That was singles and albums. And so in January 1980, the first #1 song on their chart was called Where's Captain Kirk by Spiz Energy. I had actually never heard that song, but I punched it in YouTube and there it was. Just like everything else I've looked for, it seems to be on YouTube. So that probably explains where the indie term came from as far as being used a lot to mean independent. Keep in mind, there have been independent businesses since the formation of this country, and even further back. So there have been independent record companies, which I talk about in my video, The History of Indie Music, but I even said in that I didn't think the term was used until the 70s. And it turns out to be right, unless you can find an earlier reference. There might be some references in the mid-70s, but I find the further back you go, the less likely you're going to see that word indie being used by journalists and just everyday people. But again, the concept of independent films and independent music and independent culture, that was pretty big in the 60s. It was also big in the 50s, and it was because of independent labels that rock and roll became popular. And I don't know if it could have been popular without independent labels. So these days, the term indie is used a little bit differently than I'm sure the British used back in the late 70s. And I think they were really applying it to something specific, like the punk music scene. But today, I see the word indie being thrown around a lot, and I just take it to mean independent. So when I use the word indie, I'm mostly referring to independent businesses. In other words, they're not big, major, worldwide corporations. They're more like regional businesses. That could be just small chains, or it could be companies that have independent thinking. And that's kind of how I use it as well. So it's an umbrella term to mean a lot that has a lot to do with independence. So this would be music that doesn't conform to the charts. It doesn't. It isn't based on a formula. And I just want to point out that Reverb Nation, which has over 1 million independent artists, they have many genres listed. So it's not just one genre. And I think it's a mistake to think of indie as a genre, because that's not what it is. Unless you're being super specific, like indie pop rock or indie pop or indie rock. But even then, that's a wide open genre of lots of styles. So it's really supposed to mean it came from the independent mental process, and it's not conforming to like big biz. That's how I use the term. So now you know.